Hello everyone and welcome back once again to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and today we're continuing onward with our Make Your Game series of videos, where we take a walk through game development process, one phase at a time, with a focus on defining the reason for these steps and how they benefit the process on the whole. Up until this point, we've been primarily working in what we would typically call the pre-production phase, preparing documentation and answering a number of key questions about our goals with the game project, so that we have a clear picture in our minds of what we need to do to finish this game. As we recently have defined our important tasks and created an itemized feature list and gotten a basic view of how much work should be required to make the game we're hoping to make, now would be a great time to consider looking at the earliest parts of the production phase. We're ready to begin prototyping. Unlike full production of a game, the prototyping phase, which is frequently skipped, is meant to create a sort of proof of concept for our game, to throw minimal resources into the project while testing out the mechanics that we've defined, and creating something that will tell us whether the game that we have in our heads is, indeed, as fun as we think it will be. Although we've done a fair amount of due diligence above, with answering our lists of questions and preparing a whole lot of documentation, up until this point, everything we've done has been theoretical and very subjective. Until you've had an opportunity to play something firsthand, you'll rarely have a clear idea of whether, in practice, your gameplay, or even the game's concept on the whole, is fun or not. And at least in my mind, that's the most important thing that we should be looking at when creating a game. If we were to just start going down our feature list one item at a time and implementing them, it could very easily be months before we know for sure what our game actually feels like. That's where the process of prototyping comes in. In video games, there are a few commonly accepted forms that the prototype manifests in, and each have an important role to play in our pre-alpha phase. The prototype, the vertical slice, and the MVP. I'll go over each in a moment, but essentially the function that all of these serve is to give the creator an opportunity to flesh out their game's mechanics in a smaller scope, requiring significantly less investment in the process. By prototyping, we can try before we buy, as it were, testing each piece and altering them as necessary in various different forms. The first, the prototype, is the least committed of the pre-alphas. The entire function of the prototype is finding only the most important mechanics of the game and getting them working in a way that will allow evaluation of the mechanics and a redesign as quickly as possible. In a first-person shooter with a special mechanic like Portal, where the player shoots portals onto surfaces and travels between them, the prototype would focus entirely on the portal mechanic and perhaps the physics interactions around it. This would allow us as developers to understand once in-game how traveling through portals feels, to learn the points where a player could become disoriented, or to have trouble working out how to actually make use of it. The idea of this prototyping phase is to strip out anything that's unnecessary. We most likely have placeholder art or even textureless cubes to make up our character and game world. There will be no sound, no real bells or whistles, just pure functioning versions of the key mechanics that you wish to test out. Depending on the complexity of the mechanics, even prototyping can take a fair amount of time, but one should be able to work out what parts of the mechanic can be kept or saved for later. Like if we were prototyping a new gun for a shooter and wanted to test out if the way that the gun shoots reads correctly, we wouldn't likely concern ourselves with things like ammo capacity and reloading, damage values, and so on. Just the physics of our gun and whatever it's meant to accomplish. The prototype is meant to be experimented with, and you should be ready to scrap it in its entirety. It's the one time during development that we should be happiest throwing away work, because we know that it might not be right for the game. If we were doing this during a production phase, that slows down the whole line and is usually a costly process. Based on the results of our prototyping phase, it may even lead us to go back to the drawing board of our game altogether. If the entire conceit of your game revolves around a mechanic that isn't fun without major tweaks, we'll have found that out in time to do something about it, as opposed to have poured our time and energy into making something that sucks and being unable to back out. Once our prototyping phase has completed, however, and we're sure of our mechanics and ready to implement them, comes what's known as the vertical slice. This is meant to invoke the idea of a picture of a building, perhaps, or a creature that's been perfectly vertically cut to show what's inside, but only really a single 2D part thereof. Like a slide on an MRI, it gives us a look at the important components, but not the whole picture. The vertical slice is just that. A pre-alpha proto-game that includes all of the important components of the game, whatever those may be, mechanics, art, or otherwise, and creates something playable out of them. a representative snapshot of what the game will be, though perhaps missing a significant amount of content. While the prototype gives us the opportunity to scrap and review and amend our components in a controlled environment, it's when we create that vertical slice that we really get the opportunity to see how those actually feel as part of a game. For all intents and purposes, the vertical slice is a working game. Often it would make for a fairly empty experience, as frequently none of the game's volume has been filled out, but when we have a vertical slice, we know what our game is. At the point of completion of the vertical slice, we should be committed to our game's mechanics, and will instead be looking at the interactions thereof. It'll give you a sense of how our balance works, and whether any one mechanic is overpowering the others. We could have perfectly fun and serviceable sneaking mechanics, but if our combat is too powerful and renders the sneaking pointless, that will alert us to that, and give us an opportunity to make changes to either or plan to add more ways to make sneaking viable or combat less viable. We should know, through creating this vertical slice, how fun our game has the potential to be on the whole, as opposed to looking only at individual small parts thereof as we had been doing in the prototype process. After the vertical slice, we work towards our MVP, which stands for Minimum Viable Product. The MVP is an odd beast, however, and in some ways it's difficult to classify it as purely a pre-alpha, the reason being that, for all intents and purposes, the MVP is a finished, even polished game. What the MVP is exactly as the name implies, the smallest finished version of your game. Something that you could ship, and, if perhaps small or short, could be considered a full reasonable game on its own. I spoke at length about feature creep in a previous video, and this plays in part into that, as the MVP is the antithesis of feature creep, the version of your game that has only the barest of essentials to be considered finished. What should be considered a minimum viable product is up for debate and largely in the hands of the game's creator, but what's important, in this case, is to define what can be omitted from the planned final product and still have it be shippable. You're welcome to consider it a safety net if you feel so inclined. It should always be the first point that we as developers aim for. By working our way through these individual steps during our process, we can always be aware of the potential tripping points of our project and ensure that we're ready to take care of them long before they become more than we can handle, or can do permanent, irreparable damage to a product. Next week, we'll be taking a look at the iterative development process, the sprint, the scrum, and the road to release. But for now, I just wanted to thank you for joining me today, and I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of ThursDev and found it entertaining and educational, or at least one of those two. Thank you as always for joining me, and I'll see you again next time. Take care.